Listen up, because what happened last Saturday night was the most brutal family dinner in human history, and I cannot wait to tell you how this plays out. But first, let me give you the full backstory because this has been building for years. I'm 32, been married to Natalie for 8 years, and her family has treated me like absolute garbage from day one. Not obvious garbage, the subtle, passive-aggressive kind that makes you question if you're imagining things. Her dad Adam owns this mid-sized construction company and constantly makes these little digs about how I should be earning more in IT support. Not direct insults, just comments like, must be nice having such a relaxed work schedule when I get home at 6 p.m. Or Natalie's always talking about wanting to renovate the kitchen while staring at me meaningfully. Her mom Gabriella is even worse. This woman has perfected the art of making me feel unwelcome without saying anything technically wrong. She'll set the table for family dinners, and somehow my place setting is always slightly off from everyone else's. When I bring wine or dessert, she'll thank me, but immediately set it aside like it's not good enough for the meal. She has this way of asking about my job that makes it sound like she's asking about a hobby I'll eventually outgrow. Elizabeth, Natalie's sister, works in real estate and never misses a chance to mention how well she and her husband Kurt are doing. Their new Mercedes, their upgraded kitchen, their vacation to Italy. But it's not just bragging. She'll specifically mention these things when Natalie complains about money or when I'm talking about work. Like clockwork. If I mention getting a small bonus or finishing a big project, Elizabeth will immediately pivot to something Kurt accomplished that makes my achievement look pathetic. Ross is Natalie's younger brother. Total gym bro, who treats me like I'm physically defective. He's always suggesting I join his CrossFit gym, or making comments about how I need to get serious about my health. He'll flex and joke around with other family members, but gets this look of mild disgust when he has to interact with me directly. Last Christmas, he actually asked Natalie in front of everyone if I'd ever played sports, like he was trying to diagnose what was wrong with me. But here's what really pisses me off. I started noticing that they had all these family group chats and get-togethers that I wasn't included in. Natalie would come home with inside jokes I didn't understand, or she'd mention something that happened at family dinner when I thought we were supposed to go together. When I'd ask about it, she'd get defensive and say it was just a last-minute thing, or that I wouldn't have been interested anyway. 3 years ago, something clicked. I was at their house for Adam's birthday, and I caught Elizabeth, Ross, and Natalie having this intense conversation in the kitchen that stopped dead when I walked in. They all got weird and awkward, and Elizabeth actually laughed and said something about how they were just talking about work drama. But the way they looked at each other, the way the conversation died, I knew they were talking about me. That's when I started paying closer attention, really watching and listening instead of just trying to fit in and be liked. And holy hell, once I started looking, I saw everything. The WhatsApp group chats Natalie would quickly minimize when I came near her phone. The family gatherings I wasn't invited to that happened conveniently when I had to work late or had other commitments. The way conversations would pause when I entered rooms, not in a guilty way, but in an annoyed way, like I was interrupting something important. I started documenting patterns. Not in some psycho-stalker way, but just keeping track of things in my head and, occasionally, in my phone notes. How many family events I was excluded from, the specific comments about my job and income, the way they'd all exchange looks when I talked about work projects or achievements. 6 months after I started paying attention, I confirmed what I already suspected. I was helping Natalie clean up after dinner, and her phone was on the counter next to me when a WhatsApp notification popped up from Elizabeth. The preview said, "Can't believe we have to deal with another 3 hours of his boring work stories tomorrow." It was sent to a group chat called Sunday Planning that included Natalie, Elizabeth, Ross, and both parents. I didn't grab her phone or try to read more. I didn't need to. I already knew they had a family group chat without me, where they complained about having to tolerate me at family functions. The betrayal was complete. That's when I started making strategic moves. Not revenge moves. Protective moves. I opened my own checking account and started having my paychecks deposited there instead of our joint account. I quietly moved some of my investments into accounts that only had my name on them. I found all our important documents and made copies that I stored somewhere safe. I consulted with a lawyer about asset protection, not divorce, just protection, and made sure everything I owned before the marriage was properly documented as separate property. I also started improving myself in ways that would benefit me regardless of what happened with my marriage. I got serious about work and started pursuing certifications that would increase my salary. I joined a gym and actually stuck with it. I took a public speaking class to get better at presenting myself. Not because I wanted to impress Natalie's family, but because I wanted to be in the strongest possible position if my marriage fell apart. The whole time, I watched them get more comfortable with their little family conspiracy. They stopped trying to hide the group chats. Natalie would openly text in front of me, and I could see she was responding to messages in Sunday planning or family updates, group chats that existed specifically to exclude me. Elizabeth would make comments about family discussions I wasn't part of. Ross would reference inside jokes from gatherings I wasn't invited to. But the thing that really sealed it was watching how they treated Lorenzo, Elizabeth's ex-husband, when he came to pick up their daughter for his custody weekend. They were polite but dismissive, treating him like a necessary inconvenience they had to tolerate. And I realized that's exactly how they saw me, as a temporary problem they were waiting to get rid of. 2 months ago, Natalie started getting more aggressive about money, not asking me to contribute more to household expenses — we'd always split things fairly — but making comments about how we couldn't afford the vacation she wanted or how embarrassing it was that we couldn't keep up with Elizabeth and Kurt financially. She started comparing our life to her sister's more directly, asking why I wasn't more ambitious like Kurt or why I seemed satisfied with such a basic career. That's when I knew they were building up to something. The family had clearly decided that I wasn't good enough for their daughter, and they were working on convincing Natalie to do something about it. The Sunday planning group chat was probably full of discussions about how to get her to finally dump the dead weight. Last Saturday morning, Natalie suggested we have dinner at her parents' house. She said her whole family wanted to get together for some quality time and that her mom had specifically requested that I come because they felt like they hadn't seen enough of me lately. Which was obviously BS because they'd had 3 family gatherings in the past month that I wasn't invited to, but I played along. I spent Saturday afternoon mentally preparing. I knew this wasn't going to be a normal family dinner. The invitation was too deliberate, too inclusive after months of exclusion. I suspected they were planning some kind of intervention or confrontation, and I was actually excited about it. After 3 years of watching and planning, I was finally going to see what they really thought of me. I wore my best shirt, brought a nice bottle of wine, and walked into that house ready for whatever they had planned. Adam was grilling steaks in the backyard, wearing his expensive grilling apron and using his fancy tools. Gabriella was setting the dining room table with her good china, the stuff that never comes out when it's just Natalie and me visiting. Elizabeth was there with Kurt. Ross brought his girlfriend Mackenzie, and Natalie's best friend who I'd never met was sitting in the living room like she belonged at a private family dinner. The guest list was the first red flag. Why would Elizabeth's husband be there for casual family time? Why was Ross's girlfriend included when she'd never been to a family dinner before? And why was Natalie's friend there unless she was supposed to witness something? We sat down to eat, and everything seemed normal for the first 20 minutes. Gabriella asked polite questions about my job. Adam talked about some commercial project his company was working on. Elizabeth mentioned she'd just sold a house in the expensive part of town, but I could feel the setup happening. The questions were too pointed, too focused on getting me to talk about my work and income. They were establishing a baseline before the real conversation started. Then Adam put down his fork, looked directly at me, and asked when I was planning to get serious about my career. Not like a concerned father-in-law, asking about my professional goals, like a disappointed boss addressing an underperforming employee. The question hung in the air and everyone stopped eating to watch my response. Before I could answer, Gabriella jumped in asking why I never seemed motivated to provide better for their daughter. Elizabeth laughed and said something about how she couldn't understand why some men just accept mediocrity when they have responsibilities to their wives. Ross nodded and mentioned that his friends who work in tech all make significantly more money than I do. And here's the part that really got to me. Mackenzie, who I'd literally just met, actually said she felt sorry for Natalie, having to carry so much of the financial burden in our marriage. A complete stranger felt comfortable enough to insult me at a family dinner, which meant they'd obviously discussed me enough with her beforehand that she knew exactly what role she was supposed to play. That's when I realized this wasn't a random family dinner or even a spontaneous intervention. This was a coordinated attack. They'd planned this whole thing specifically to humiliate me and break me down in front of witnesses. The guest list, the timing, the progression of questions. Everything was designed to make me look like a failure and give Natalie permission to do whatever they'd been encouraging her to do in those group chats. But instead of getting defensive or angry, I just sat there calmly cutting my steak and nodding along. Because I'd been expecting exactly this scenario for 3 years. I'd been planning for it, preparing for it. And honestly, I was impressed by how well I'd predicted their strategy. What they didn't know was that their little family ambush was about to backfire in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Natalie looked around the table at her family's expectant faces, took a deep breath, and started talking. And that's when this whole thing really began. Update coming tomorrow because what happened next is absolutely insane. Update 1. Holy hell, you guys! The response to my first post was insane. And honestly, reading your comments while I was dealing with the aftermath made me feel so much better about what I'm about to tell you. Shout out to the person who said, "This sounds like a coordinated takedown." You were absolutely right, and it gets so much worse. So, where I left off, Natalie was looking around the table at her family's expectant faces after they'd spent 20 minutes systematically attacking my career and income. I could see her taking that deep breath, and I knew she was about to deliver whatever speech they'd prepared her for. And man, she did not disappoint. She started by saying how much she loved me, but how frustrated she'd become with our financial situation. Not our actual financial situation, mind you. We split expenses fairly and both contribute to savings. But how embarrassed she was that we couldn't keep up with Elizabeth and Kurt's lifestyle. She talked about how she felt like she was missing out on experiences because I wasn't ambitious enough to earn what other husbands earn, but then she got really specific. And this is where I knew they'd been planning this conversation for months. She mentioned the exact vacation Elizabeth and Kurt had taken to Italy that we supposedly couldn't afford. She brought up Kurt's promotion and how it made her realize that I'd been in the same position for too long without advancing. She even mentioned the new car Elizabeth had been posting about on social media and how humiliating it was that we were still driving my older sedan. The whole time she's talking, her family is nodding along like this is some kind of reasonable intervention instead of a calculated attack. Adam kept making these little confirmatory sounds like he was agreeing with a business presentation. Gabriella was giving me these pitying looks like she felt sorry for how pathetic I was. Elizabeth was smiling this smug little smile like she was watching her plan come together perfectly. Then Natalie really went for the throat. She said she'd been talking to her family about our relationship and they'd helped her realize that she needed to set some boundaries and expectations. She wanted me to commit to a specific timeline for advancing my career and increasing my income, or she was going to have to think seriously about whether our marriage was working, not whether we needed to think about it together, whether she needed to think about it. Like I was some employee being put on a performance improvement plan instead of her husband. Ross jumped in at this point to say that he'd been telling Natalie for years that she deserved better, and that he was glad she was finally listening. Mackenzie, again, someone I'd literally just met, said she couldn't believe how patient Natalie had been and that most women would have left already. And that's when Elizabeth delivered what was clearly the line they'd all been building up to. She said that Natalie had been carrying me financially and emotionally for years, and it was time for me to either step up or step aside, so she could find someone who actually appreciated what an amazing woman she was. The entire room went quiet after that, waiting for my response. You could tell they expected me to get defensive, start making excuses, maybe even get emotional and beg. They wanted to see me break down so Natalie could feel justified in whatever ultimatum they'd planned. Instead, I started laughing. Not like a crazy person or anything dramatic, just this genuine amused laugh, because the whole thing was so exactly what I'd predicted. I'd spent 3 years watching them build up to this moment, and they'd executed it almost word for word how I'd imagined they would. Adam looked confused and asked what was so funny. Gabriella looked offended that I wasn't taking their intervention seriously. Elizabeth got this annoyed expression like I'd ruined her dramatic moment. I wiped my eyes and told them I was laughing because I'd been expecting this conversation for about 3 years now, ever since I realized they had family group chats specifically designed to exclude me and plan my removal from the family. The look that passed between Elizabeth, Ross, and Natalie was priceless. Pure panic. They hadn't expected me to know about the group chats, let alone to have been watching and preparing for this exact scenario. Natalie tried to deny it, but I pulled out my phone and started reading from my notes. I told them I knew about Sunday planning, the group chat where they complained about having to tolerate me at family functions. I mentioned the 3 family gatherings I'd been excluded from just in the past 2 months while they planned this intervention. I brought up specific conversations I'd overheard and messages I'd glimpsed that made it clear this was a coordinated effort. Ross got aggressive and said I sounded paranoid, and that maybe this proved I wasn't stable enough for a marriage, but I just smiled and said I'd actually found their exclusion pretty helpful because it gave me time to get my own affairs in order. That's when Adam asked what I meant by getting my affairs in order, and his tone was different now. Less disappointed father-in-law, more concerned businessman who sensed a problem. I explained that when you realize your spouse and her family are actively working against you, the smart thing to do is protect yourself. So over the past 2 years, I'd made sure my finances were properly separated, my important documents were secured, and my legal position was clear. I'd also focused on improving my career and income specifically so I'd be in the strongest possible position if my marriage ended. Elizabeth asked exactly what kind of legal position I was talking about, and now she sounded worried instead of smug. I could tell they were all starting to realize that their intervention hadn't caught me off guard at all. I told them I'd consulted with a lawyer about asset protection and made sure everything I'd owned before marriage was properly documented as separate property. I'd also opened my own accounts and started having my income deposited there instead of into our joint account. Nothing illegal or sneaky, just basic financial protection for someone whose spouse's family was clearly planning their removal. Natalie got upset and asked why I hadn't talked to her about any of this, and I just looked at her like she was being ridiculous. I asked her how exactly I was supposed to discuss my concerns with someone who was part of a family group chat dedicated to excluding me and planning interventions about my worthiness as a husband. That's when the real arguing started. Natalie insisted the group chats were just normal family communication and that I was being paranoid and controlling for tracking their conversations. Elizabeth said I was being manipulative by preparing for divorce when we were supposed to be working on our marriage, but I wasn't backing down anymore. I told them that normal family communication doesn't involve excluding one family member from every group chat and gathering so you can discuss their failures and plan interventions. Normal families don't coordinate attacks on one member during carefully planned dinners with strategic guest lists. Adam tried to take control of the situation by saying they were all just concerned about Natalie's happiness and that maybe we could work together to address their concerns. But I shut that down immediately. I told him that if they were actually concerned about Natalie's happiness, they would have encouraged her to communicate with me directly instead of spending years undermining our marriage through exclusion and conspiracy. What they'd actually been doing was preparing her to leave me while making sure I looked like the bad guy who wasn't worth fighting for. Gabriella got defensive and said they just wanted the best for their daughter, but I pointed out that the best for their daughter would have been supporting her marriage, not sabotaging it. Instead, they'd created a situation where she felt ashamed of her life and husband because they constantly compared us to Elizabeth and Kurt. Ross said I was being dramatic and that they just had high standards, which made me laugh again. I told him that high standards would involve encouraging growth and communication, not creating secret group chats to mock someone's career and plan their removal from the family. The whole dinner had devolved into this chaotic argument with everyone talking over each other, but I stayed calm the entire time because I'd been mentally rehearsing this conversation for 3 years. Every point they made, every defense they offered, I'd already anticipated it and prepared my response. Finally, Natalie stood up and said she couldn't deal with this anymore. She accused me of ruining what was supposed to be a helpful family discussion by being paranoid and defensive. She said maybe her family was right that I wasn't mature enough for marriage if I couldn't handle honest feedback about my career. That's when I stood up too and told everyone I was leaving. Not storming out dramatically, just calmly explaining that I wasn't going to sit there and be attacked by a family that had spent years excluding me while planning my removal. But before I left, I looked directly at Natalie and told her she should think very carefully about what she wanted to do next. Because while she'd been spending 3 years planning this intervention with her family, I'd been spending 3 years planning for the aftermath. I walked out of that house, got in my car, and drove home. And that's when things got really interesting. Update coming tomorrow because her reaction when she got home was absolutely unhinged. Update 2. You guys, the comments on my last post were absolutely incredible and honestly gave me the strength to handle what came next. To the person who said, sounds like you're about to find out what they really planned, you were spot on. And to everyone asking what my endgame is, just keep reading because it's about to become very clear. So I left the family dinner from hell around 8 p.m. and drove home. I wasn't angry or upset. Honestly, I felt relieved that the charade was finally over. For 3 years, I'd been watching this family plot against me while pretending everything was normal. And now we could all stop pretending. I got home, opened a beer, and sat down to wait. I knew Natalie would come home eventually, and I knew she'd be furious that I'd ruined their perfectly planned intervention. What I didn't expect was how completely she would drop the mask once she realized I wasn't going to play the role they'd assigned me. She walked through the door around 10:30 and I could tell immediately that she'd spent the past 2 hours getting coached by her family. She had this determined expression like someone who'd been given a script and was ready to perform it. She started by trying to be reasonable, saying we needed to have a serious conversation about our marriage and my behavior at dinner. She said she was hurt and confused by my reaction to what was supposed to be a supportive family discussion about our future together. I just looked at her and asked if she seriously wanted to keep pretending this was about support instead of sabotage. I asked her to explain how excluding me from family group chats for 3 years while planning interventions about my worthiness as a husband qualified as supportive. That's when her whole demeanor changed. She got defensive and said the family group chats were none of my business and that I was being controlling for monitoring her communications with her family. She said it was normal for families to have private discussions and that I was being paranoid and possessive. I told her that normal families don't have private discussions specifically designed to exclude and undermine one member. Normal families don't spend 3 years coordinating someone's removal while pretending to support the marriage. She got more aggressive and said maybe the reason her family had concerns was because I was clearly unstable and paranoid. She said tonight proved that I couldn't handle honest feedback about my career without turning it into some conspiracy theory about her family plotting against me. But here's the thing. I'd been expecting this exact conversation for months. I knew that once their intervention failed, they'd switch tactics and try to make me look like the problem. So I stayed completely calm and asked her specific questions. I asked her to explain why I wasn't invited to Adam's birthday celebration last month when everyone else was there. She said it was a last-minute thing, and she didn't think I'd be interested. So I asked her to explain why Elizabeth's promotion celebration 2 months ago was also too last-minute to include me, and why Ross's graduation from his training program was another last-minute family thing I somehow missed. She got frustrated and said she couldn't remember every family get-together and that I was being ridiculous for keeping track. So I pulled out my phone and showed her my notes, documenting every exclusion, every group chat reference, every family event I'd been systematically left out of for the past 3 years. That's when she really lost it. She started yelling about how creepy and controlling it was that I'd been documenting her family interactions. She said I was acting like a stalker and that maybe her family was right that she needed to seriously reconsider our marriage. I told her I wasn't stalking anyone. I was protecting myself by keeping track of a coordinated campaign to exclude me from my own extended family. I asked her how she would feel if my family spent 3 years excluding her from group chats and gatherings while planning interventions about whether she was good enough for me. She said that was completely different because my family actually liked her, which was hilarious because it proved she knew her family didn't like me and had been deliberately excluding me. Then she tried a different approach. She said maybe her family had valid concerns about our relationship and that instead of being defensive, I should listen to their feedback and try to improve. She said they all cared about both of us and just wanted to see us succeed. I laughed and asked her to explain how lying to me about family gatherings for 3 years showed they cared about me. I asked her how creating group chats specifically to exclude me demonstrated their investment in our marriage's success. She got quiet for a moment and then said something that made everything clear. She said maybe the problem was that I'd never really fit in with her family and that she was tired of constantly defending me to people who loved her and wanted the best for her life. There it was. The truth she'd been hiding for years. She'd been defending me to her family instead of defending our marriage to her family. She saw me as a burden she had to justify instead of her husband she should protect. I asked her how long she'd been tired of defending me, and she said probably since the second year of our marriage when it became obvious that I wasn't going to become the kind of husband her family expected her to have. So I asked what kind of husband they expected her to have, and she listed off everything they'd been measuring me against. Someone who made more money, someone who was more ambitious, someone who fit better with their social circle, someone who shared their interests and values. Basically, she wanted me to be Kurt, Elizabeth's husband, instead of myself. I told her that if she wanted to be married to Kurt, she should have married him instead of spending 8 years trying to transform me into someone else. I said it wasn't fair to marry someone and then spend years resenting them for not becoming a different person. She said marriage was about growth and compromise, and that I'd never been willing to change or improve myself to meet her family's expectations. She said other husbands would have taken their feedback seriously and worked to address their concerns. That's when I decided to stop holding back. I told her that over the past 2 years, I'd actually made significant improvements to my career and income. I'd gotten certifications that increased my salary by 30%. I'd been promoted twice. I'd built up substantial savings and investments. She looked confused and asked why she didn't know about any of this. So I explained that when your wife and her family are actively working to exclude you and undermine your marriage, the smart thing to do is protect your assets and career independently. I told her that all of my recent income increases had been deposited into accounts that only had my name on them. All of my career certifications and achievements had been documented separately. All of my investments and savings growth had been managed independently. She got upset and asked why I'd been hiding financial information from her. And I pointed out that I hadn't been hiding anything. I'd been protecting myself from people who were clearly planning my removal from the family. Then she asked how much money I'd been keeping separate, and when I told her the amount, she went completely silent. It was significantly more than she'd expected, and I could see her trying to process the implications. She asked if I'd been planning to leave her this whole time, and I told her I'd been planning to be in the strongest possible position if she decided to leave me based on her family's pressure. That's when she started crying and said she'd never planned to leave me, that the intervention was supposed to help us work through our problems together. But I reminded her that she'd specifically said I needed to commit to advancing my career on her timeline, or she'd have to reconsider our marriage. She said she'd only said that because her family had convinced her that ultimatums were necessary to motivate change. She insisted she'd never actually intended to leave me, but I wasn't buying it anymore. I told her that people don't spend 3 years excluding someone from family functions and creating group chats to mock their career unless they're building up to something permanent. I said her family had clearly been preparing her to leave me by gradually normalizing the idea that I wasn't good enough for her. They'd been systematically undermining her respect for me while positioning themselves as the supportive family, helping her see the truth about her marriage. She tried to deny it, but I asked her to explain why tonight's dinner had included Elizabeth's husband and Ross's girlfriend and Natalie's best friend, unless it was designed to be a public humiliation that would justify whatever they'd planned to do next. She couldn't answer that, so I told her I was done pretending this was all a misunderstanding. Her family had spent 3 years working to end our marriage, and she'd been a willing participant in the plan. I said if she wanted to leave me for someone who met her family's standards, she was free to do that. But she shouldn't expect me to cooperate with being portrayed as the inadequate husband who drove her away. She asked what that meant, and I told her it meant that if she wanted a divorce, she could have one. But it would be based on the truth about what had actually happened in our marriage, not on the narrative her family had constructed about my failures and inadequacies. She said she didn't want a divorce, that she wanted to work things out and rebuild our relationship. But I told her that rebuilding would require her to choose between her marriage and her family's campaign against me. I said she couldn't have both. She couldn't be married to someone while participating in a family group chat dedicated to planning their removal. She couldn't claim to love me while defending her family's right to exclude me from their gatherings and mock my career. She asked what I wanted her to do, and I told her that was up to her to figure out. But I was done being the husband who had to earn approval from people who'd already decided I wasn't good enough. She went to bed crying, and I stayed up planning my next moves. Because what she doesn't know yet is that I'm not just prepared to defend myself, I'm prepared to go on the offensive. Final update coming tomorrow because the frantic texts from her family have been absolutely perfect. Final update. Reddit. You absolutely delivered with the advice and support. Reading your comments gave me the strength to see this through to the end, and I cannot thank you enough for helping me realize I wasn't crazy or paranoid. I was just finally seeing clearly. So Sunday morning, I woke up to 17 missed texts from various members of Natalie's family. 17. And let me tell you, the progression from concerned to desperate to absolutely panicked was better than any revenge I could have planned. It started with Adam texting around 6 a.m. asking if we could all sit down and have a calm discussion about Saturday night. Very reasonable, very father figure, trying to manage a crisis. Then Gabriella texted an hour later saying she was worried about how things had ended and wanted to make sure everyone was okay. But by 9 a.m., the tone had completely shifted. Elizabeth was texting asking what I meant when I said I'd been preparing for years. Ross sent a message asking if I was planning to divorce Natalie. Mackenzie, who I barely know, somehow got my number and texted asking if there was anything she could do to help fix the situation. The best part was watching them realize that their little family conspiracy had backfired completely. Instead of breaking me down and forcing me to grovel for acceptance, they'd handed me all the evidence I needed to protect myself and given me 3 years to get ready. Natalie woke up around 10 and immediately saw me reading the texts. She asked what her family was saying, and I showed her the progression from reasonable concern to barely controlled panic. I watched her face change as she realized they weren't texting her. They were texting me directly because they knew she couldn't control the situation anymore. She asked what I was going to do, and I told her I'd already decided. I was done with all of it. Done with being the husband who had to prove himself worthy of basic respect. Done with being excluded from family gatherings while they planned my removal. Done with pretending their behavior was normal or acceptable. She started crying and said she didn't want our marriage to end over a misunderstanding with her family. But I pointed out that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was exactly what they'd intended. They'd spent 3 years systematically undermining our marriage, and she'd participated willingly. I told her the truth that I'd been thinking about all night. The problem wasn't just her family's behavior, it was that she'd chosen them over me every single time. She'd chosen to participate in their group chats instead of defending our marriage. She'd chosen to exclude me from gatherings instead of insisting I be included. She'd chosen to let them measure me against Elizabeth's husband instead of appreciating who I actually was. She said she could change, that she could set boundaries with her family and prioritize our marriage. But I asked her why she hadn't done that in the past 8 years. Why it had taken me threatening to leave before she was willing to stand up for our relationship. She didn't have an answer for that. That's when my phone started ringing. Adam was calling, and I could see the desperation in how quickly he'd escalated from texting to calling. I answered on speaker so Natalie could hear the conversation. He started with his usual reasonable tone, saying he'd been thinking about Saturday night and realized there might have been some miscommunication. He said the family just wanted what was best for everyone, and maybe they'd expressed their concerns poorly. I told him there hadn't been any miscommunication. They'd executed exactly the plan they'd been developing for 3 years. They'd coordinated an intervention designed to humiliate me and give Natalie permission to leave me for someone who met their standards. He got quiet for a moment and then asked what it would take to fix the situation. He said family was important and everyone made mistakes and surely we could work through this together. I told him the situation was already fixed. Their plan had failed because I'd been prepared for it. I wasn't the weak, dependent husband they'd assumed I was, and I wasn't going to beg for acceptance from people who'd already decided I wasn't good enough. That's when his tone changed completely. He said I was being unreasonable, and that Natalie deserved better than a husband who would abandon his marriage over family disagreements. He said if I really loved her, I'd be willing to work with her family instead of trying to turn her against them. I laughed and told him I wasn't turning Natalie against anyone. I was simply refusing to participate in a family dynamic where I was treated as a temporary problem they were working to solve. If Natalie wanted to be part of a family that excluded and undermined her husband, that was her choice to make. He tried to argue, but I cut him off and told him the conversation was over. I said if any of them wanted to have a relationship with me in the future, they could start by apologizing for 3 years of deliberate exclusion and manipulation. Until then, they could keep their family gatherings and group chats. I wouldn't be participating. I hung up and looked at Natalie, who was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. She said she'd never heard me talk to her father that way, and I told her that was because I'd spent 8 years trying to earn his respect instead of demanding the basic courtesy I deserved. She asked what happened now, and I told her that was up to her. She could choose to rebuild our marriage on a foundation of mutual respect and boundaries, or she could choose her family's approval, but she couldn't have both. Over the next few hours, the texts from her family got increasingly frantic. Elizabeth was demanding to know what I'd said to upset Adam so much. Gabriella was asking if I was seriously going to end my marriage over a family disagreement. Ross was accusing me of being manipulative and controlling. But here's what they didn't understand. I wasn't trying to control anything. I was simply stepping back and letting them face the consequences of their own choices. They'd spent 3 years assuming I was weak and dependent, and now they were realizing I'd been quietly building a life that didn't require their approval. The financial independence I'd built meant I didn't need Natalie's income to maintain my lifestyle. The career advancement I'd achieved meant I didn't need their business connections. The legal preparations I'd made meant I was protected regardless of what happened to our marriage. Most importantly, the emotional growth I'd experienced meant I didn't need their acceptance to feel good about myself. I knew who I was and what I was worth, and it wasn't dependent on their opinion. By evening, Natalie had made her choice. She said she wanted to try to rebuild our marriage, but she wasn't ready to completely cut off her family. She wanted to find some middle ground where we could all coexist peacefully. I told her there was no middle ground. Her family had declared war on our marriage, and you can't compromise with people who are actively working to destroy your relationship. She had to choose between being their daughter who they could manipulate and control, or being my wife who I could trust and respect. She said she needed time to think about it, and I told her she could have all the time she needed. But while she was thinking, I'd be moving forward with my own plans. The next morning, I started looking at apartments. Not because I'd given up on our marriage, but because I was done living my life based on other people's decisions. If Natalie chose her family over our marriage, I'd already be prepared to move forward independently. The apartment search felt liberating in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in 8 years, I was making decisions based purely on what I wanted, not on what would earn approval from people who'd already decided I wasn't good enough. As I'm writing this update, it's been a week since the dinner from hell. Natalie is still thinking about her choice. Her family is still sending increasingly desperate texts asking what they can do to fix things. But here's what they still don't understand. There's nothing to fix. This isn't a problem that can be solved with apologies or promises to do better. This is the natural consequence of spending 3 years treating someone like they don't matter. They assumed I was weak and would eventually break under pressure. Instead, I got stronger and prepared for exactly this moment. They assumed I was dependent on their approval and would do anything to earn it back. Instead, I built a life that doesn't require their validation. Most importantly, they assumed I didn't know what they were doing. But I saw everything, documented everything, and prepared for everything. To everyone who commented on my previous posts, thank you for helping me see that I wasn't paranoid or unreasonable. I was just finally ready to stop accepting unacceptable behavior. Whether Natalie chooses our marriage or her family's manipulation remains to be seen. But either way, I'm going to be fine. Actually, I'm going to be better than fine. For the first time in 8 years, I'm going to be free. Update. Natalie made her choice this morning. I'll be moving into my new place next weekend. The frantic family texts have now turned into angry accusations that I manipulated and controlled their daughter. It's amazing how quickly people show their true colors when they lose power over you. To everyone asking about the apartment, it's perfect. 1 bedroom, great view, close to work, and absolutely zero family drama. I can't wait to start this next chapter.